Hello and welcome to the Fighting Moose podcast. I'm your host and narrator, Jason Hendrickson. This is a podcast where I retell stories, some fictional and some historical, that can be enjoyed by people of all ages. I always like to think that every story takes the reader on a journey, whether it be through history or some fictional realm. Well, in today's episode, we go on a journey with Grandfather Frog as we read the story, Grandfather Frog's Journey, from the book Mother West Wind's Animal Friends, written by Thornton W. Burgess. Today's story comes from last night's events. We had a bonfire at the house, and after dinner, when walking in between the bonfire pit and the house to get some more stuff, a toad hopped across the sidewalk in front of us. John stopped and picked it up, carried it around for a few minutes to show my wife, and then released it back into the wild. Then, as we sat around the fire eating our s'mores, he said that I should do a story about Grandfather Frog, so here we are. While working on today's episode, I was thinking about whether or not our friend Mr. Burgess was still alive, because I think it would be cool to talk with him. Sadly, he is not. He died in 1965, about 20 years before I was born. I think he would be a person I would like to meet if they ever invent time travel. Until they get the whole space-time continuum thing figured out, I will be content with reading Mr. Burgess's stories and going on adventures in the green forest and green meadow. Now, let's turn to today's story. I hope you enjoy. Let's begin.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Grandfather Frog's Journey. Grandfather Frog sat on his big green lily pad in the Smiling Pool, and Grandfather Frog was asleep. There was no doubt about it. Grandfather Frog was really and truly asleep. His hands were folded across his white and yellow waistcoat, and his eyes were closed. 3 times the merry little breezes blew a foolish green fly right past his nose. Grandfather Frog didn't so much as blink. Presently, Billy Mink discovered that Grandfather Frog was asleep. Billy's little black eyes twinkled with mischief as he hurried over to the slippery slide in search of Little Joe Otter. Then the 2 scamps hunted up Jerry Muskrat. They found him very busy storing away a supply of food in his new house. At first, Jerry refused to listen to what they had to say, but the more they talked, the more Jerry became interested. "We won't hurt Grandfather Frog, not the least little bit," protested Billy Mink. "It will be just the best joke and the greatest fun ever, and no harm done." The more Jerry thought over Billy Mink's plan, the funnier the joke seemed. Finally, Jerry agreed to join Billy Mink and Little Joe Otter. Then the 3 put their heads together, and with a lot of giggling and chuckling, they planned their joke on Grandfather Frog. Now Jerry Muskrat can stay a very long time underwater, and his teeth are long and sharp in order to cut the roots on which he depends for much of his food. So Jerry swam out to the big green lily pad on which sat Grandfather Frog fast asleep. Diving way to the bottom of the Smiling Pool, Jerry cut off the stem of the big green lily pad close to its root way down in the mud. While Jerry was at work doing this, Billy Mink sent the merry little breezes hurrying over the green meadows to call all the little meadow people to the Smiling Pool. Then, when Jerry Muskrat came up for a breath of air, Billy Mink dived down, and getting hold of the end of the lily pad stem, he began to swim, towing the big green lily pad after him very slowly and gently so as not to waken Grandfather Frog. When Billy had to come up for air, Little Joe Otter took his place. Then Jerry Muskrat took his turn. Across the Smiling Pool, past the big rock, they towed the big green lily pad, while Grandfather Frog slept peacefully, his hands folded over his white and yellow waistcoat. Past the bulrushes and Jerry Muskrat's new house, past Little Joe Otter's slippery slide, sailed Grandfather Frog, and still he slept and dreamed of the days when the world was young. Out of the Smiling Pool and into the Laughing Brook, where the brown water flows smoothly, the three little swimmers towed the big green lily pad. It floated along of itself now, and all they had to do was to steer it clear of rocks and old logs. Once it almost got away from them on the edge of a tiny waterfall, but all three pulling together, they towed it out of danger. At last, in a dear little pool with a mossy green bank, they anchored the big green lily pad. Then Billy Mink hurried back to the Smiling Pool to tell the little meadow people where to find Grandfather Frog. Little Joe Otter climbed out on the mossy green bank, and Jerry Muskrat joined him there to rest and dry off. One by one, the little meadow people came hurrying up. Reddy Fox was the first. Then came Johnny Chuck and Striped Chipmunk. Of course, Peter Rabbit was on hand. You can always count Peter in when there's anything going on among the little meadow people. Danny Meadow Mouse and Happy Jack Squirrel arrived quite out of breath. Sammy Jay and Blacky the Crow were not far behind. Last of all came Jimmy Skunk, who never hurries. Each in turn peeped over the edge of the mossy green bank to see Grandfather Frog still sleeping peacefully on his big green lily pad in the dear little pool. Then all hid where they could see him when he awoke, but where he could not see them. Presently, Billy Mink reached out with a long straw and tickled Grandfather Frog on the end of the nose. Grandfather Frog opened his eyes and yawned sleepily. Right over his head, he saw jolly, round, red Mr. Sun smiling down on him just as he last saw him before falling asleep. He yawned again and then looked to see if Billy Mink was sitting on the big rock. Where was the big rock? Grandfather Frog sat up very suddenly and rubbed his eyes. There wasn't any big rock. Grandfather Frog pinched himself to make sure that he was awake. Then he rubbed his eyes again and looked down at the big green lily pad. Yes, that was his, the very same lily pad on which he sat every day. Grandfather Frog was more perplexed than ever. Slowly he looked around. Where were the slippery slide and Jerry Muskrat's new house? Where were the bulrushes, and where was the Smiling Pool? Grandfather Frog's jaw dropped as he looked about him. His own big green lily pad was the only lily pad in sight. Had the world turned topsy-turvy while he slept? "Chug-a-rum," said Grandfather Frog. "This is very strange indeed." Then he turned around 3 times and pinched himself again. very strange indeed," muttered Grandfather Frog over and over again. He scratched his head first with one hand and then with the other, and the more he scratched, the stranger it all seemed. Just then he heard a giggle up on the mossy green bank. Grandfather Frog whirled around. "Chug-a-rum!" he exclaimed. "Billy Mink, come out from behind the tall grass and tell me where I am and what this means. I might have known that you were at the bottom of it." Then out jumped all the little meadow people and the Merry Little Breezes to shout and laugh and dance and roll over and over on the mossy green bank. Grandfather Frog looked at one and then at another, and gradually he began to smile. Pretty soon he was laughing as hard as any of them, as Billy Mink told how they had towed him down to the dear little pool. "And now, Grandfather Frog, we'll take you home again," concluded Billy Mink. So as before, Billy Mink and Little Joe Otter and Jerry Muskrat took turns towing the big green lily pad, while in the middle of it sat Grandfather Frog, catching foolish green flies which the merry little breezes blew over to him. Reddy Fox, Johnny Chuck, Peter Rabbit, Danny Meadow Mouse, Striped Chipmunk, Happy Jack Squirrel, and Jimmy Skunk raced and capered along the bank and shouted encouragement to the three little swimmers, while overhead flew Sammy Jay and Blacky the Crow. And, never once losing his balance, Grandfather Frog sat on the big green lily pad, enjoying his strange ride and smacking his lips over the foolish green flies. And so they came once more to the Smiling Pool, past the slippery slide, past the bulrushes and Jerry Muskrat's new house and the big rock, until Grandfather Frog and his queer craft were once more anchored safe and sound in the old familiar place. "Chug-a-rum," said Grandfather Frog. "I think I'd like to go again."
Listen, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Fighting Moose Podcast. Please join us next time as we read another exciting story. Today's music was provided by the artist Analog by Nature, and the audio clips were provided from NASA. For more information to download and or listen to audio or materials from all our recordings, or to contact us, please visit www.thefightingmoose.com, or you can follow the links in the show notes. And as always, try and do a random act of kindness every day.
Mission complete, Houston. After serving the world for over 30 years, the space shuttle's earned its place in history and it's come to a final stop.